I am joined by three distinguished panelists, Taylor Fravel, Brad Setzer, Paul Isaac, and I would ask them to each spend a moment introducing themselves to you.
Great. Hi, I'm Taylor Fravel. I'm a professor of political science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I also direct MIT's Security Studies program.
I'm Brad Setzer. I'm probably best known for tweeting about the balance of payments, but I am formally a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And I'm Paul Isaac. I run a fund here in New York, and I guess I'm the one who can be awash in nostalgia that this used to be a very good setting for a table when this was the Stock Exchange Luncheon Club main dining room several decades ago.
Super, thank you guys. I will tell you, we are going to finish on time, primarily because Brad's services are demanded at the New York Fed. So as soon as we wrap up with this session, you'll see him bolting for the door. But I want to make this interactive, and I also want to set some parameters before we get into the specifics. So I'm going to start with Taylor. You have spent a lot of time looking at the security issues here. Help us understand what those issues are, because as we've prepared for this, you've shown a light on a lot of things that were completely, things I as an investor hadn't fully considered incorporated into my analysis. So tell us what set the table stakes for us.
Sure, yeah. So just by way of background, my academic work is on China's foreign and security policies, which sort of brings me, I think, to this panel. And I did want to reflect sort of very broadly on sort of the security dimension and in particular, the probability of conflict that might erupt in the short to medium term between the United States and China. So 4 quick points. If we look at sort of academic research on sort of the frequencies of wars in the international system, I know not a very exciting topic, but the probability of war is very low. It's less than 1% that any two pair of states that share a border might end up in a war in any given year. And even among great powers, it's not that high. So that's sort of the good news, Overall, we can be relatively confident, that war is relatively infrequent. But this brings me to my second point, which is about sort of the U.S.-China relationship in particular. Everything that we know about what leads states to war, all of those risk factors, are growing in the context of the United States and China. So you have sort of the overall power transition with China's sort of dramatic rise over the last 2 decades in terms of its economic growth, but that generates a lot of economic tools that can be used to advance Chinese interests, some of which Brad, I'm sure, will talk about. It also generates a lot of money to invest and modernize China's armed forces. At the same time, in the last 4 years, 5 years, maybe you've seen a pretty significant increase in the level of competition in all domains between the United States and China, from national security to technology to the economy more generally, and even to sort of ideas about how to structure societies and global governance. And in particular, amid all of this, from a security standpoint, you do have this dramatic modernization of China's armed forces. And one way to think about this is back in 1990, I think what China spent on defense was roughly 2.5% of what the United States spent on defense. And depending on how you calculate now, China is spending 40 or 50% of what the United States spends on defense. So catching up quite rapidly. But in addition, China is focusing almost all of that defense spending on generating capabilities to project power in East Asia, So it's not yet a global military power. It may have those aspirations later, but for now, it's really focusing on putting itself in a dominant position in sort of the Asia-Pacific region, whereas the United States, which is spending much more, is also trying to sort of pursue and maintain its sort of global military posture. So it has to spread those defense dollars sort of much more widely. Some other ways in which China is catching up, if we look at major sort of surface combatants and something called vertical launch systems. These are the tubes you put in destroyers to launch missiles for air defense or other purposes. China now has maybe 2/3 of the number of major surface combatants of the United States and slightly less than half sort of the number of those weapon systems. And I could sort of go on here, but on the capability front, it's really, really impressive what China has done. And that really animates all of these security issues because China has tools that it didn't have before. The third point, though, is amid this broader competition, amid sort of the growing role of military power, you have an issue, that could actually lead to a major conflict between the two states. And this, of course, is the status of Taiwan. Now, in again, in the study of international sort of politics more generally, we know that wars erupt over territory more than any other issue, right? So this should just worry us by being a very large unresolved dispute. But it's embedded in this power transition that's going on between the US and China, and has become an issue in which I think the stakes have been raised quite considerably. So I think both sides view it as a litmus test as to how the other sort of might behave on broader interests, and we're seeing much greater sort of competition as a result. So what does this all mean? And just to wrap up very quickly here with my last point, kind of what are the pathways to conflict over sort of the short to medium term? I think we could look at 4 possibilities. The first would be sort of the decisive resolution from China's standpoint of kind of the conflict over Taiwan. And this is the sort of invasion scenario that gets talked a lot about in Washington, D.C. I think this is unlikely for a number of reasons. Executing successfully an amphibious assault is the most challenging task any military can undertake. It's often not successful, even though we all think of D-Day as being a great success in sort of American history. And I think China fully understands that it does not yet have sort of the military that could do this, and there's some sort of significant obstacles that would sort of maintain sort of a very high level of cost that they would face. The Chinese economy is not doing well at the moment, so there are a lot of economic headwinds I think would make them reluctant to pursue this course of action. And there's a lot of interesting politics going on that frankly I don't think we fully understand, but we can see kind of the consequences of, and this would be the purges of really large numbers of senior officers in the People's Liberation Army, including 3 of the 6 officers who serve on sort of the main body overseeing China's military affairs. So all this suggests, right, the costs are high, the politics are weird, the economy is facing headwinds, not a moment when a leader is going to be quite confident about executing that kind of a military operation. It could be that China uses force out of necessity because they believe Taiwan, or perhaps the United States in the ways in which it supports Taiwan, has crossed some red line. And I think this was probably perhaps the pathway I worried most about through the end of the Biden administration. You saw significant deepening of the US-Taiwan security relationship. President Biden made a number of statements about how the United States would, of course, come to Taiwan's defense, which sort of went beyond kind of at least what official policy was and contained in a variety of documents. But with the new Trump administration, I think you've seen kind of an easing of this in a variety of ways. Trump himself has not made the same kinds of statements as President Biden. And now, of course, the desire for some sort of a US-China deal seems to have sort of overwhelmed the efforts to sort of continue that robust sort of increase in support for Taiwan. And so President Trump and Xi Jinping will likely meet later this fall at a meeting in Asia. China has extended an invitation for Trump to visit early in the new year, and Trump has extended sort of a nominal invitation for a reciprocal visit. And so this suggests that this desire, right, to reset the U.S.-China relationship in some way is sort of trumping the concerns that China might have about sort of facing a situation where it might have to use force. And then finally, right, a last pathway, which is perhaps the most likely one today, would be some sort of an accident or unintended consequence of some other event. And so China's putting a lot of increased pressure on Taiwan, not just military, but the military pressure is very evident in terms of the aerial incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone, the frequency of ships around the island, and so forth. And something could happen in that context that sort of sets off a chain reaction of events that escalates much more rapidly than anyone anticipates. So a Chinese pilot could be shot down by a Taiwanese air defense system that maybe wasn't authorized to shoot down an incoming aircraft, or vice versa. Like, exactly how it gets going is less important than when you're in a really competitive relationship. You think the stakes are really high, and something has happened, right? Your first instinct is to want to sort of show resolve and toughness and escalate in response. And that could then set off sort of an unexpected chain of events that leads us to some kind of high level of conflict that, in fact, neither side would really want. So let me end here and turn it back to you.
Okay. So all of that analysis seems to reflect your assessment of what are generally trends that take a long time to gestate and produce results. As I turn to Brad, like, we've got, you must sell TikTok or it's going to be shut off in the US, and then we delay it half a dozen times until we get a deal. We've now got China investigating NVIDIA for monopolistic practices, even after the US said, okay, you can go sell chips there. We've got these tit-for-tat tariff escalations and de-escalations. Like, what do the economic numbers tell you from a trade and capital flow perspective about where China is economically and how strong the economic underpinnings are for the story that Taylor just described?
So China's economy is really very bifurcated. Looking at the title there, the export sector is a steel dragon squared. Exports have been growing at 3 times global trade in 2024. They've maybe slowed to grow at 2 times global trade in 2025. 10% year to date in volume terms, some small deceleration. China's getting well over a percentage point of growth, sometimes close to 2 percentage points of growth, just from the export side. And for a really big economy, that is really difficult. So the fact that China is now the world's largest auto exporter, it's not an accident. Those are the kinds of things that have to happen for an economy of China's size to get this much growth from exports. And there's been enormous resilience in that export story in the face of US tariff escalation. China's made up almost all the lost markets in the US with increased sales globally. Some of that is derived US demand, parts for final assembly to get around the tariffs. China's domestic economy, by contrast, has been in a protracted period of weakness. And that's part of how you get such a large contribution to growth. You're not importing. Literally, Chinese import volume growth has been stalled for the last 18 months. That's unusual, again, for an economy that is at least notionally growing at 5%, and if you net out exports growing at 3%, you would broadly expect import volumes to track growth. China hasn't fully recovered from the property market shock. Property was a huge part of the economy that turned down in 2021. It is still going down. Residential investment, the equivalent of that, is still trending down. The financial consequences of the real estate bust haven't been fully cleaned up in the banking system. The property developers, they're kind of starting to do real restructurings, but they're still mostly relying on new infusions of credit to keep going from the state banking system. So you have neither reached the bottom of the real estate downturn, nor have you fully cleaned up the legacy. What has prevented an outright collapse has been an enormous wave of investment in, guess what, manufacturing. And again, it's easy to just say, oh, they've pivoted back to investment in manufacturing, but this is done on such an incredible scale that it's kind of hard to comprehend. The way I like to try to explain it is that 6 years ago, China had a combustion engine automotive sector capable of producing 40 million cars, which is, close to half of global auto demand. Domestic demand's been 25 million for a long time. And in the past 5 years, they have now built an electric vehicle automotive industry that is capable of producing 25 million cars too. And only a small part of that has been conversion of combustion engine factories to EV factories. So incredible amounts of investment channeled primarily to the manufacturing sector to offset weakness in the real estate sector and continued slow consumer growth. That's the backdrop. Right now, we're clearly boxing or shadow boxing with China. And unfortunately, at least in my view, we tried to throw a knockout punch in April when we escalated tariffs to 145%. And China showed that it could dodge our knockout punch and that we couldn't throw another punch. As a matter of fact, we couldn't sustain the 145% tariffs because there are too many components that the U.S. Industry relies on were going to be cut off. And folks were just not importing, it sounds stupid, we're not importing Christmas trees, artificial Christmas trees. Turns out, if you were going to import an artificial Christmas tree, you do it over the summer. And you put up money in the hope of selling it at Christmas, obviously. If you're going to have to pay 145% tariff and double your price, are you going to put up the money up front to take that risk? And you don't know if you're going to be able to pass the full cost increase on to your consumers. And so that part of the U.S. economy was just stalled. So we were kind of forced, I think, to back down. China also discovered that its well-developed sets of leverage, notably around permanent magnets and rare earths, critical minerals, were more powerful than I think they even thought. It turns out we had not prepared. I think the Trump administration thought permanent magnets were only used in clean tech, and so therefore they didn't need to worry about them because they weren't interested in clean manufacturing. Unfortunately, they're also used in defense, fighter jet engines, radars, missile guidance systems, yada, yada, yada. Real problem. And then, China is still using its leverage, not buying soybeans, not buying Boeings, not yet approving TikTok, although they're dangling that, all in the hopes of getting a deal. And I think what Xi has signaled pretty clearly is that he won't accept an unequal deal like the Phase 1 deal, where China accepted all U.S. tariffs and agreed to still buy U.S. goods. I don't know that the Trump administration is capable of accepting less than Phase 1. So I think that's why we're kind of at a little bit of a negotiating impasse. But China's approaching this, despite a weak domestic economy, with a reasonably high level of confidence, because they think they have stood up to one of the strongest forms of leverage the U.S. has.
Got it. So, Paul, what I've heard here, a lot of rising power, a lot of global, if you want to call it geopolitical intrigue. Brad talked about the position of the economy. That's a marked contrast from what I think of as ubiquity in the US, right? Like, we have one economy, we have these sectors, like that applies to every industry, and every industry gets impacted differently. But before you even get to that, in China, you've got all of these other factors to consider. Where does that leave you as an investor in China?
Well, at the risk of antagonizing the moderator, I think China's about 3% of global equities. It's about 27% of the MSCI emerging markets, the last numbers I had. And I just don't think that China really is appropriate for index investment on the part of American investors. And I think there are a number of reasons why, some of which will overlap a bit with my fellow panelists. First, China, while it has been an enormous success story, the Chinese leadership doesn't believe their economic statistics and publicly say so. If you take a look at things like some long-term nocturnal light emissions studies, the Chinese economic growth may have been overstated by as much as a quarter to a third, which, particularly given the residuals involved, means their savings rate may have been much less high than people thought. And a lot of indicia in corporate reports that are hard to fudge, things like toll roads and various types of infrastructure investments, indicate that the economy has in fact been flat now pretty much since COVID. The Chinese workforce peaked about a decade ago. Working age population, it has been in decline. For China to reach its 5% stated real GDP target, you need to have something like a 6% productivity growth, which would be, I think, unprecedented for a middle-income economy of China's nature. And furthermore, you're kind of running out of many of the drivers that actually helped the Chinese economy during the first 30 years of its growth. Namely the enormous conversion of relatively low productivity labor, particularly from rural areas, into an urban workforce, and a relatively free hand for businesses in the face of what is normally a fairly tightly controlled economy. By anecdotal reports, our party committees are much more active in companies now, and you have a real problem in terms of the nature of the labor pool that you've got, quite apart from the demographic structure. Moreover, when U.S. investors invest in Chinese companies, they invest through something called variable interest entities. The Chinese government has never acknowledged that these are a legal mechanism. In fact, they are widely deemed to be technically illegal under Chinese law. Chinese companies are audited by Chinese accounting firms under Chinese standards, even when those accounting firms are affiliated with large non-Chinese firms. So the Chinese courts often do not uphold private contractual arrangements and are heavily swayed by various types of public interest or other considerations. The treatment of extensive foreign investment into troubled Chinese property companies has been charitably harsh. And even the people who had relatively senior debt claims overseas have received de minimis recoveries. So when there's a problem, the foreign investors tend to take the back of the line. The Ukraine precedent is disturbing in terms of portfolio investment in China. If there were a problem over Taiwan, I think you'd assume there'd be some kind of a sanctions regime, and you probably would get a very significant markdown. It's been 90 to 95% on Russian securities like GDRs, and you can't transact in them. So what's a fair tail risk haircut on China? And the broad equity markets in China actually have very poor long-term track records. The MSCI index has been around since 1992. I think the compound rate of return has been about 2% in dollar terms. And Chinese equities have actually been virtually flat over the last 10 years. So while the Chinese economy is capable of remarkable things, and many of them are in state sectors and state security sectors, the question as to whether you will have access to those as a foreign investor, I think is pretty problematic. So as an illustration, and I think you have a pretty sizable exposure to the Chinese economy through your other investments. I commend everybody to read a book called Apple in China by Patrick McGee, who was the correspondent for the FT, who covered Apple for about 5 years. The book is, on the one hand, a triumph of the development of a supply chain and the enormous sophistication of an industry and the development of terrific manufacturing capabilities in China, with mainland entrepreneurs and subcontractors elbowing aside the Taiwanese firms that were originally deeply involved. But on the other hand, at the close of the book, you come away with the feeling that Apple has got a real problem long term in terms of the degree of dependency that it has on China, which could reflect itself in stock performance in various ways under various scenarios. A lot of big companies, simply because of the size of the Chinese market, have a lot of exposure, and there, at least, I would have greater confidence in the managerial incentives of the foreign companies doing business in China, as well as their accounting and controls. So my argument, basically, where I come away with is there certainly are people who will make a trade out of the Chinese market. We are currently in the middle of a real pop with some major investors talking about how inexpensive the Chinese market is and how they're riding various types of official initiatives. But my impression is for this group, which is looking for long-term asset allocations and not trying to time those sorts of exposures, I would argue that China may be just a bridge too far.
Okay. You said, at the risk of antagonizing the moderator, you just said the moderator asked a stupid question. You're not even interested in getting to the fundamental now. So I think that's a fair point. There's so many other, like Rumsfeld unknowables that it's not worth the effort. So that's fair.
Yeah.
Okay. Brad, one thing I have trouble wrapping my head around is this rotation from, and you just, like, for those of us who watched China for a long time, you said, well, investment is spent, trade should be spent, but that's where they keep going. Why is it so hard to rotate this economy towards more domestic consumption for the sake of balancing it and making it more sustainable? I know they've done a fair amount policy-wise in the past couple of quarters trying to incentivize domestic spending, but it doesn't really seem to be moving the needle.
And it's a really good question. I mean, I'm not convinced they've done all that much. I mean, what they've done are these kind of trade in your old car, get a new car. We'll give you a discount or a subsidy for that. Trade in your appliances, get a new ones. Those kinds of incentive schemes can give you a short-run pickup, but they tend to pull demand forward. My simple answer to this question is that Xi himself doesn't believe that a consumer-driven economy is a strong economy. I think Xi thinks of consumption as a luxury indulgence. He certainly has repeatedly said that he doesn't believe in, they're communists, yeah. I mean, they believe in the primacy of the party. They're Leninists. They ain't very socialist. She talks all the time about the evils of welfarism and how that would undermine the work incentives of China. And he's repeatedly refused, in a sense, to send out checks to support consumers. He's very, very, very willing to encourage local governments to write checks to build factories. But actually handing people money so that they could spend it domestically and then letting consumer preferences drive investment in the Chinese economy has just been something he's unwilling to do. I think I would point to a couple of other more structural features as well. One is that China's central government, and people tend to talk about debt in the Chinese economy, and there's a lot of debt. Most of that is at the local, provincial level. The central government is both small and financially conservative, fiscally conservative. So Chinese central government debt is only 30% of GDP. We're at like 100. It's one of the lowest in the G20 if you just look at central government GDP debt. And the financial powers that be in the Ministry of Finance are really quite conservative. They don't want to raise the fiscal deficit on a sustained basis. They're uncomfortable with 4. They'd like to get it back down to 3. We're at 6. So in the middle of a property downturn, they just didn't let the central government finance consumer subsidies. And then throw on to it, and hey, I'm going to get in trouble. We collect 8% of GDP in income tax. I imagine there's a big debate in this room about whether that's too much or too little. China collects 1% of GDP in personal income tax. What that means is you cannot finance very much redistribution. You can't do things like our earned income tax credit, which support income and therefore consumption at the low end of the income distribution. And China relies extremely heavily on a very regressive payroll tax because of its design and consumption taxes to raise revenue. So the tax system really penalizes consumption. And those are kind of structural things which you could change, but she hasn't wanted to change.
Fair. Taylor, what you've described around Taiwan, and you said like the highest probability was an accident. Just doesn't make me feel good as somebody who likes to manage risk. But if I think of that eventuality, not the accident one, but like something happening in Taiwan that becomes a conflict, my sense has always been that that is the caboose of a very long train. And it passed us by on the tracks, and then the caboose, okay, now there's something going on. What are those flashpoints that people should be watching for to say, like, we're dialing it up a notch, we're dialing it up a notch?
Terrific question. So I think...
I'm triggering you, or...
I'm sorry?
I'm triggering you, or...
No.
You're triggering, you're giving the...
Well, the caboose metaphor is a new one for me, so... But I think what you would find, right, is a combination of factors. So from China's standpoint, they care a lot about eventual unification. There's not really a timeline. Xi Jinping has said some things like, we don't want to pass this down from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. Pretty vague. There's some sense maybe they want to achieve this by mid-century, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. So there's a little bit of time pressure, but there's not immediate time pressure, which I think is important. China's still committed to trying to do this peacefully. It doesn't actually want to do it through military conflict, but it believes it might not have an alternative. So that's an important distinction. So then you get into sort of China's mindset, and what would be the things that would lead them to conclude there is nothing other than sort of military force to solve this. It could be their perception that somehow Taiwan not only wants sort of indefinite separation, but that the U.S. also wants this, which is not sort of really the current U.S. position, and will invest a lot in effectively keeping the two separated. So if China were to come to that conclusion, and we're not there yet, then I think you would see sort of increasing kind of pressure to test sort of the U.S. commitment to that, to test Taiwan's commitment to that, and that could then take on a life of its own. Separately, China's putting a lot of pressure below the threshold of military force on Taiwan. Taiwan is now actually beginning to respond in some really impressive ways, and I think many of us who were watching this situation were worried that Taiwan, for a period of time, didn't appear as it was committed to its defense as perhaps America was committed to its defense, and that's never a situation, right, you want to be in, because ultimately when the balloon goes up, it's going to be what Taiwan does in the first 24 to 48 to 72 hours that will matter the most before, right, a response occurs. So you see China trying to maintain a fairly high level of pressure on Taiwan through the displays of military power that take place around the island, through a variety of sort of disinformation and other kinds of information campaigns, through good old-fashioned intelligence and other ways of sort of interfering in Taiwan's sort of society. I would say for now, that will continue, but the fact that Taiwan itself is fairly divided politically between sort of the three main parties, and the current president only received 40% of the vote in a three-way race. It wasn't really the sort of compelling mandate that I think their sense that Taiwan is going to be moving in this way has been allayed a little bit, and then sort of the outcome of this recall campaign over the summer, in which the ruling party tried to get voters to unseat opposition party legislatures for being too close to China, completely failed. Not a single one went through, and I think China looked at that and said, okay, using China or using us as a way to mobilize politically kind of has some limits in Taiwan, and that sort of has longer term implications. So I think we'd want to watch kind of where the top line sort of political trends are going. Within that, we then want to watch how this pressure is escalating. China has found ways to continue to raise the military pressure, but also stays well below kind of the threshold of force, and they do seem fairly committed to that because it serves lots of other interests. This is why the accident scenario, though, is worrisome, because you could have a deliberate policy of wanting to be below that threshold, but something that happens that is unintended or unplanned that kicks you above that threshold, then you may feel you have no sort of choice but to respond.
Right. When we were preparing for this, we had a couple of discussions beforehand, and I always like to think in terms of wing scenarios, like something crazy, and I don't mean like an accident, but like the one that couple that I floated was, well, maybe the Taiwanese would just say, okay, fine. Like, let's just, kumbaya. Another scenario would be that there's insufficient support domestically for Xi. You had some really, for me at least, insightful thoughts about those kind of wings, and not specifically those wing scenarios, but the stuff that we don't get exposed to in regular news flow.
That's a huge potential
11 minutes.
Set of 11 minutes. We want to get to the audience as well. So I would just say I think there are a lot of known unknowns. So for example, our focus on conflict over Taiwan today is premised on the fact that the Communist Party is still going to be in power in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. Now, as I was telling Mike earlier, I would never bet against the Communist Party on anything, really, because when they set their mind to something, they can be pretty committed to achieving it and not necessarily face some of the domestic obstacles you would see elsewhere. But it is possible that politics in China might change, which could have a salutary impact across the strait. It could also have a more negative impact across the strait under some other scenarios if what really replaces that is something that's even more sort of nationalist in orientation, and because of the way in which one China has been sort of propagated, since 1949 on the mainland, it could actually lead to sort of greater tension. So we don't really know which way that would go, but it could probably more likely go in a more conciliatory way, and that is something that we just don't have on our bingo cards, right? So I remember 10 years ago, we were all wondering, when is the Chinese economy going to overtake the US economy? And I'd be curious to know what Brad thinks, but it doesn't look like the Chinese economy is now on a trajectory to overtake the US economy. In fact, it seems to be sort of growing separation. And so I think we can get caught up in the moment of where we think the long-term trends are headed, but in fact, we can not necessarily be too confident in that because of the way in which the intervening years will shift the trajectory.
Got it. If we have the microphone available, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Oh, up front here.
when you talked about the investability of companies in China, you mentioned that the book on Apple. There's another more recent book by Dan Wang, Breakneck, and I think in the book he suggests that there's a few reasons why Chinese leadership really didn't care about their financial markets, or that they purposely set up different companies in different provinces to compete against each other, which prohibited winners at the time, or it furthered technology, and also that might be changing now as they need to think about their capital markets a little differently, and they try to make more and more transactions globally. So would those things be more of a possible trend? Would that change your thinking at all?
The Chinese have had some discussions, what they call involution, which is pretty clearly excessive competition, and they're trying to do some winnowing of some industries dealing with significant overcapacity like copper smelting and steel. The problem, and actually Xi made some statements recently on a visit where he was complaining that the problem is I say that I want to have high-speed chips, and suddenly everybody's got to have a high-speed chip center. China is in some ways a kind of odd place. We think of it as very top-down, but there seems to be a great deal of autonomy, and that autonomy often seems to breed all kinds of competitive efforts to try to conform to what they see as the general directive, broad directives from the central government. And that actually has been a continuing economic issue for them. But they certainly would like to become more efficient. One other point I would make, by the way, on the difficulty of increasing consumption is you're now 3 generations into a one-child policy in China. Admittedly, they've tried to reverse it in recent years. The Chinese do not have a particularly robust social safety net, particularly for the elderly. So you need to save if you are a Chinese, because you probably don't have a lot of kids to rely on, and you aren't going to be getting a lot of help from the government. And that apparently is a major problem in getting people to start popping the champagne corks now.
Got it. Other hands? Yeah, up front.
Chris, I think you deserve the opportunity to try to rebut Paul.
We'll take it up afterwards. Thank you.
This question's for Brad. If you could just comment quickly on how you kind of describe the economy's bifurcated between exports and kind of this kind of consumption. How long into the future can the Chinese economy continue to export and grow those exports? Is there an upper cap? Is there a capacity constraint to that?
Great question. I feel humble in trying to answer it because I keep forecasting that China will hit limits, and China keeps blowing through my limits. Right now, China's manufacturing trade surplus is 2% of world GDP, $2 trillion. That's bigger than the biggest combined manufacturing surplus that Japan and Germany ever ran when Japan and Germany were the export leaders of the world. It's up about $1 trillion over the past 5 years. That has corresponded with China taking a leading position in a whole host of industries that are kind of viewed as strategic. So you can easily see why a linear extrapolation of that trend would suggest that China would hit limits. China will be exporting on current trends 10 million cars a year. The global market for cars outside of China is maybe 60 million, ballparky. You can view that in a lot of different ways. You can view this as the highest concentration of exports relative to the outside their home market that any country has ever achieved. And this is counting production in China, doesn't count. Like Toyota in Thailand, I would consider Thai, not Japanese. Or you can say there's still like 40 to 50 million cars that could be made in China that are not being made in China. My personal view is that you're beginning to see the limits. You're beginning to see countries other than the United States conclude that they are running the risk of losing key industries if they maintain low tariffs, open markets to China. But you haven't yet seen those actions crimp in a real way the momentum of the Chinese export sector. So in some sense, I actually think agency here doesn't rest with the United States. In a sense, we've shown that we really aren't that keen on becoming more dependent on China for manufacturing. We have some difficulties figuring out how to bear the cost of reducing our dependence when our production is way more expensive than Chinese production, and private money doesn't want to go into an industry which China is already oversupplying when they're going to be entering at a high price point. So we haven't solved that problem. But conceptually, we don't want to be more dependent on China. I think agency rests with those other markets. And just to push back a bit on will China catch up? They're not catching up at all in dollar GDP. But we shouldn't be too confident in that. They've far surpassed us in many important manufacturing sectors. So they're lapping us on sectors that actually do matter and that are strategic. And so I would focus a little less on the GDP catch-up and more on those sectors where China's still on an accelerating trajectory. Are there points of strategic dependence that we should care about?
So on the agency, Brad, is there a collective response which can force the China? I mean, if the U.S. and the European Union, which they talk a big game on this, but never kind of multilaterally unite. I mean, China doesn't have another alternative but to sell all this stuff to all of us. I mean, and maybe that's a little Pollyanna view of how.
I think look, China has done a pretty good job recently of selling a lot of capital goods to Africa, which is a sector where the U.S. doesn't. Our companies don't try to compete because it's not that profitable. But your bigger point is one which I fundamentally agree with, and so, I've written a paper about it. I highly recommend my paper for the Aspen Economic Strategy Group.
More so than the Huang book.
Well, no, Dan's book is beautiful, and Dan writes beautifully. He's a friend of mine. You should really. If it's anything like his annual letters, it will be a beautiful read. And his thesis is profound and important. If you want to read boring, wonky Washington, D.C. policy recommendations about allied scale and how we could collectively construct leverage against China by joining forces rather than fighting trade wars with each other, I recommend my work.
Fantastic. Other questions from the audience?
This one kind of goes along with what you've talked about as far as Africa goes. But if all the Western society kind of is on the same page and eventually we go through what we did with Huawei and telecom, they got to go somewhere. Is the Belt and Road Initiative still something that they're doing, or is it giving them an opportunity to sell more EVs to people in Uganda? Things of that nature. I'm just curious, where are they going to go with the overcapacity, and particularly with their advanced technology you were talking about, when it's very simple for us to just do what we did with Huawei?
It's actually not simple for us to do what we did with Huawei, because we've discovered in a lot of sectors that if we zero out Chinese supply and participation, we zero out all of our downstream sectors. So it's a little harder to decouple. The Belt and Road has evolved. The Belt and Road of 10 years ago was a boom in lending from the Chinese, China XM, China Development Bank. They're two big policy banks. It was a great accomplishment for China to both set up these banks, give them, I think, fund them out of their reserves, and over a 10-year period, both of these banks reached the same scale as the World Bank Group. Not one, but two. That was a big, major achievement. They can't do that another time. They've overextended on the lending front. And what you're seeing is much more encouragement, as opposed to lending to countries to hire a Chinese contractor to build a road or build a dam. They're lending to Chinese companies to make investments in these countries. So it's been an evolution, but it has kept China at the forefront of the thinking of most African countries at a point in time when they think they are not at the forefront, one might say, of concern in Washington. And they have doubts about Europe too. I mean, what China showed is that Africa wants money. They don't want lectures. What China also showed is if you just lend money, you don't always get your money back.
And on that note, Paul, Taylor, Brad, thank you guys so much. Thank you all for coming back in. We appreciate you spending time with us. And I know Brad does have to run, but we will be out in the lobby if there was anything we didn't get to cover that's still on your mind. Thank you, everyone.